I want to thank everyone for joining us and for attending and for giving us a portion of your precious time. Um, I'm actually speaking to you from Saskatchewan, and it's very cold outside, so I honestly don't mind being, tied down or committed with an indoor event, because I'd much rather have an excuse not to go outside or anything, because it's minus 30 right now outside. This event is the first virtual event being hosted by the Olive Branch think tank. The Olive Branch think tank is a Canadian organization. It is a nonpartisan organization that is dedicated to research on Palestine, and it works to ensure that Canada's policy on Palestine is in line with Canada's human rights agenda and democratic values. And in addition to the content that the Olive Branch is producing on its website and that it distributes through its mailing list, it has begun a campaign to start up a series of virtual events moving forward. And this is the first of such virtual events. And the topic we chose for this event, for this panel discussion, is titled Turtle Island and Palestine, Common Pains. Now, I was thinking about sort of giving some remarks as to why we chose this topic. And frankly, every time I sort of try and enter into the mode of thinking about why we chose this topic in order to relay this to our audience, I find myself immediately going back to sort of my personal motivations as to why I think that why I thought this was an important topic. And frankly, I think this experience or this personal motivation to a large extent is reflective of what goes in the minds of many of us. So I don't think it's something that's unique to myself. And really, many of us grow up either because of ethnic or even religious connections to the land of Palestine. To us, Palestine is a live issue, and it's one that really attracts lots of our attention and our focus. And oftentimes it is the issue by which we judge decision makers or people of influence and whatnot. And as one grows older, one starts to realize that life is not that simple, meaning that there isn't just that one issue that exists in this world. And one starts to realize that Palestine does in fact have a twin, and that twin is Turtle Island, which is the land on which we reside. And this has forced people such as myself to ask and also strive to answer very difficult questions about who we are and where we live, and the wrongs that have occurred in the past and the wrongs that continue to occur, and the pains that people in this land have felt in the past, and the pains that are being still discovered and uncovered, and the healing process involved. And so Turtle Island is a live issue as much as Palestine is a live issue. And so to the extent that there are difficult questions and difficult answers to be sought, that's simply a part of the process of building a consistent and principled framework in the way we see the world and in the way we deal with lots of the issues that we witness in today's world. And so the first step is upon this realization is for one to educate themselves. And I consider myself as an attendee of this event, here as a student trying to learn about the commonalities and this relationship between the struggle in Turtle Island and the struggle in Palestine. And the second step is also to even reach a second observation or a second realization, which is the two often go hand in hand, and that one cannot take a certain stance in one and at the same time justify what is truly a contradictory stance with the other. And what we will often notice is, and to this day, I'm this type of person to some extent, is, one will zealously advocate for something with regards to Palestine, but that zeal will fade away when it comes to Turtle Island. And on the flip side, you might find someone who is more than willing, a Canadian politician, for example, in the Canadian Parliament, might be more than willing to um, go ahead with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge the land on which that they are standing, and that it belonged to a indigenous population before this person's arrival or the arrival of their ancestors. But if you ask them about Palestine, you know, and any acknowledgement about the land of Palestine, it doesn't flow out of their mouth as easily. And so there's sometimes that contradiction in the way we deal with these two issues. And so part of this event is to learn about these two issues, the commonality between these issues, what brings them together, what can be learned from both of these experiences in order for us to deal consistently with both, and to realize that the issue of Palestine is intimately connected to the issue of Turtle Island, and vice versa, that the issue of Turtle Island is also intimately connected to the issue of Palestine. And so this is the motivation as to why we at the Olive Branch think tank decided to have this as our first panel discussion. And we hope that it will be an informative discussion. And I certainly hope to be one of those who benefit immensely from the valuable insights of our speakers.
I am honored here to be amongst you. I was gracious, or like really grateful to receive the invite from the Olive Branch think tank. And Mark as well, who will speak earlier or later here. And we had been speaking earlier about these things, but one of the points that came up earlier from Amir was about sort of the twin existence between the indigenous peoples of North America, and who like we also kind of view as like our kindred souls or spirits of the Palestinians who, you know, to our mind are indigenous to that particular territory. We and in overlapping ways, there's a lot of twinning of the experience that we've had. We watch the news, and I've seen some of the removals and destructions of neighborhoods in recent days, the removal of elderly folks from their homes for the ongoing expansion into Palestinians, like into homes and residential areas. It may be something that we had experienced several years ago, and in terms of that, like, you know, might be 150 years ago, but we also are undergoing it a little bit today. So I am Algonquin. I'm from a little tiny reserve that is 6.9 square kilometers, so about the size of a neighborhood. And for me, whenever I look at what transpires in Palestine these days, is something that I understand what is occurring a little bit less forcefully, but with the legitimation of the violence of the state using the letter of the law and what it's done to us, and especially in terms of human rights for ongoing dispossession, mostly for territorial reasons, the eradication of our presence from our homelands as well. So we may be a little bit more assimilated and with the world's eye on Canada, you know, purporting to be an international champion on the world stage of human rights. At home, it's, if you follow the news as well, we still have a lot of lingering issues that place us well behind, although when I watch the news in Palestine, I see some of the same atrocities that we've been seeing for the last century, the sort that we may not see visited upon Indigenous peoples. And, you know, I don't want to bring it up for fear of triggering, but I do see Israeli Defense Forces unleash arbitrary exercising of state violence to what I would say are, you know, executing people. Quite often, this, you know, when you turn your military against your own people, and in certain circumstances, we have seen it in Canada in our lifetime, and we still sort of see it as well with the militarization of sort of the pseudo-military, paramilitary federal police force of the RCMP that goes into some of our territories to remove us for the purposes of westward expansion, or well, the expansion of the West anyways, for ongoing dispossession. For West neoliberal capital expansion, especially. And to understand what goes on in Palestine is the strategic value for the West to remove Palestinians from their homeland so that they can install military forces to have access to the, you know, the East, as it were, the Middle East, and that doorway to the rest of the world. It differs a little bit, and but I know that for the Indigenous folks on this side of the river, from the river to the sea. It's a little bit of a gulf, but we know it across. We do empathize and understand a little bit what you're going through, not exactly, but we see the same sort of force that came out of colonial crowns of Europe and whatever sort of successor states afterwards, which have largely been captured by organized capital and their imperialist ambitions, are still at work to uh, dispossess us, forcibly eradicate us, and liquidate our possessions for their own, imperialist agendas of sorts. I know we're going to have a lot of discussion later on, so I can go on and on. I am a professor of political science and Indigenous studies at the University of Ottawa, and these are the things that I teach on a daily basis. But I'm inspired and a lot of it informed by, because I keep a close eye on what settler colonialism is doing to, and the brazen settler colonialism, because even though we're all watching in the West, it is still the apathy and antipathy of like the settler state, the ones that are supposed to be upholding and fighting for human rights purportedly, that turns a blind eye to it, especially in Palestine. That I can watch certain things unfold there and say that's possible for what they could do here, although they don't often. It's usually, I think it's a little bit too close to the West, within the West here, for them to get away with those sort of brutalities and atrocities that they take, carry out on almost a daily basis, weekly basis in Palestine, but also in the global South. So organized capital, corporate capital gets away with some terrible things as it makes its own incursions into the South Americas, other parts of Africa and Asia, for instance. But it is, it's it does inform my understanding of the dispossession, and I think it may be a cautionary tale for what's happening to the Algonquins ourselves. And when I say that I'm on my homeland, and it's six, and I'm not living on the reserve right now. I live just north of Ottawa, but on Algonquin territory, is that we're engaged in the largest modern treaty in Ontario's history for the span of 36,000 square kilometers. And yet our reserve is only 6.9 square kilometers. A lot of people can walk that distance linearly anyways, within half a day, or they can go for walks that are 5 to 10 kilometers and cover that. That's what we're sort of going to be left with. Although, I mean, there's going to be some other territory, but the sort of end game of it all, and it's sort of almost a cliche now, is the repopulation of these territories of a different people. So to remove, say, Palestinians, or at least make them a people of ancient history, and no longer people of the present, in the same way that settlements and colonial, well, settlements, since they had seen it as more than just a trade partners, actually people just to liquidate or remove for the purposes of being able to plunder our territory, is a phenomenon that sort of a little bit more in the historical institutionalist way has been spread out over 400 years. What is happening very rapidly since, I guess, well, I mean, there's a longer history for in the Middle East, but especially since the creation of Israel and the West's hand in that to, I mean, remove you from that territory. And we see it sometimes. I put up, and I've done this in my class last term, is the diminishment of Palestinian territory over in Israel, the movement into the West Bank. You could show the maps over the certain years where less and less territory, and you can see the same sort of thing unfold with North America, especially as what was held as indigenous sovereign territory prior, and over decades, the consolidation of settler colonial forces, removing them, resettling them, repeopling them with their own, and forcing and eradicating us from our own homeland. And there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. So It's useful for comparative reasons to keep an eye on one another, but it's also, as Amir said, like it's sort of like the twins, and we don't have to necessarily talk to one another to feel the pain of one another too. So maybe I'm not a twin, but I have a younger brother and a sister who are twin. And you know, if there is anything truth, if there's any truth to the mysticism that they talk, like, you know, they can sort of be empaths with one another in ways that we can't, you know, having that kindred spirit amongst them, is that we can sense the pain in ways that I don't, maybe outsiders don't understand too. So seeing the atrocities on television almost weekly from Palestine, it resonates with us as well. And maybe I can talk about it too. You know, some of the work that I've done too, and more recently, one was a little bit more personal, is just from the, say, sibling of one of my siblings who died as a result of, you know, some of them are from Grassy Narrows, which is northwestern Ontario, which endures and continues to endure. Like, it was only in the last year or so that there was a sort of a settlement for the establishment of a mercury poisoning treatment center, care center, because 90% of the reserve communities up there in that one area suffer from Muhannad disease, which is mercury poisoning, a whole lot of neurological conditions. But seeing my sister die at the age of 6 of something that was done because of just this environmental racism, treated as though they could be dealt with as disposable for the purposes of colonial capital, is you know, it strikes me whenever you see the tears of a mother across the sea. And yeah, so we can empathize with it, and it's that sort of twin spirit that I think touches us. And so I'm really happy here today to be with you and Palestinian brothers and sisters, and look forward to more of the discussion later. So thanks, and sorry for bumbling through this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for also sharing a personal story, because we can read statistics and we can read papers, and you folks have written so much and, you know, published so much. But when you hear the human side of it, as a Palestinian too, it hits it hits home a little bit more. Without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Yasmin, and thanks very much, Amir, and the Olive Branch think tank for organizing this, and Veldon, great to be on this panel with you. I'm speaking to you today from the homelands of the Niitsitapi, the Nakota, and the Tsuut'ina nations. These are we're all on treaty territory, and we must always be cognizant when we do these land acknowledgements that the treaties that have allowed us to be here have never been honored. The spirit of them has never been even closely attended to by the Canadian settler colonial state, and it is our moral and political obligation and duty to do something about that, and to engage this issue continuously in our everyday lives in order to oppose the settler colonial project, which is very much ongoing in this space. One point that I really liked from Amir's introduction that I want to pick up on and start with is when he talked about how some Palestinians will come here and speak with a lot of zeal about Palestinian liberation, and then that zeal kind of fades a little bit when it comes to Indigenous issues in what is today called Canada. I applaud you, Amir, for bluntly stating that. And that needs to change, and I agree with you that needs to change. And maybe I'll use my own personal story to kind of talk about how I got onto this path. So as Yasmin mentioned in her very kind introduction, I was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds. I lived there for the first 14 years of my life. The Intifada of 1987 to 1993 was my political awakening to the world. And when we immigrated initially to, well, and still my family is still there, to Halifax in Nova Scotia, the homeland of the Mi'kmaq, we didn't know anything about Indigenous people. Nothing in the immigration brochures mentioned anything about Indigenous peoples. I don't know if this is different today. I doubt it. If it is, I'm sure it's tokenism as opposed to real knowledge. But there was no mention of it whatsoever. It was just like, Canada is a multicultural liberal democracy. It's an oasis for freedom and liberty and justice for all and all of those good things that Canada stands for. And I understand that many immigrants come here thinking that. Even refugees will come here, some of them will come here thinking that and believing that. And I also understand that sometimes that belief or that perception of Canada is so strong it becomes entrenched and it takes a while to overcome it. But it needs to be overcome. And it wasn't long before we figured out that, okay, this kind of thing they're downplaying about a history of colonialism, of just like these white Europeans just came here and they shook hands and they made peace and treaties and all of that. Okay, that doesn't sound right. So it wasn't long before we as a family, even at the age of 14, 15, 16, we intuitively started to see that this was a myth, that this was a mythology, the racism against Indigenous people, who as far as I was concerned, they weren't even present at all in my high school. I don't know that there were any, but regardless if they were there or not, the racism towards Indigenous people was out in the open. It was accepted. It was just said in very casual ways. And right away, of course, being Palestinian, growing up under Israeli occupation, being told I was lesser than my entire life, I could right away see that okay, when these people talk about Indigenous people as lesser than, that's the same thing that I've experienced. So when Veldon talks about how we just know, these are the ways in which we just know what we're both going through. But I'll have to admit, I was highly uncomfortable with the idea that I was now on the, I had joined the settlers. I had now come into a situation where I am now one of the settlers. I didn't sign up for it. I didn't quite know what I was getting into, but nonetheless, I'm being honest with myself. I tried to do that. I was one of the settlers, and that's a, okay, I'll keep it clean, but you know what it did to my head. So it was just too much to try to deal with, having grown up where I grew up. So I kind of just like try to kind of put it to the side and just go, okay, well, I need to focus on, surviving in this new place that is very new, very alien, dealing with interpersonal racism, which didn't, people always thought that was the biggest thing that you face as an immigrant coming here from Palestine. For me anyway, it was like interpersonal racism here is like, used to it, know how to deal with that. Okay, this is not even as anyway, I know how to deal with it. It doesn't make it less harmful, effective, or destructive, but you know how to deal with it. You tell people to go where, and you live that way. And so I that wasn't what gave me moral anxiety or existential anxiety, I should say, as opposed to moral anxiety. Existential anxiety, it was that thinking of myself as a settler now. So I just kind of put a pin on it, but eventually I knew that I had to address that, and that process happened slowly. Probably started in grad school, becoming having more interactions with fellow Indigenous students, activists, and then later on, after grad school and into my years working at MRU with Indigenous faculty, more activists, more students, Really, it was my experience at Memorial University in Calgary with a lot of Indigenous students, faculty, and activists there that made me face it in a really head-on way. And I continue on that journey today. I'm still learning a lot. I'm still learning about the histories of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. There's still a lot more that I need to learn about the stories of settler colonial violences that they have faced in the past and continue to face today. And this is really a critical point, is that settler colonial violence, as we know in the literature, right? This has become a cliche. It's not just something that happened in the past in one war or one act, one policy. It's a continuing project. It still continues today. And so it is incumbent, I think, on certainly everyone on Turtle Island, but I just want to emphasize today, as a Palestinian Canadian now speaking to other Palestinian Canadians, that it is incumbent on all of us to undertake this journey of facing the fact that Canada is not what it promotes itself to be on the world stage and internally. That is a mythology, and we have to break that down that mythology. So for my fellow Palestinian Canadians who are still not seeing it quite that way yet, let me tell you, Canada's mythology is no different than Israel's mythology. The same way that you see right through Israel's mythology, you should see through Canada's mythology. It's the exact same one, because they're both settler colonial states. And Veldon is absolutely correct when he says there are similarities and there are differences. I don't downplay those. Comparative approaches of settler colonialisms should be a vibrant field of study and public debate and public discussion. But one thing that settler colonial states do share is that they always conceal and hide their settler colonial violences, both the ones they've done in the past, the ones they're doing now, the ones that they're planning on doing in the near and long future. And they hide those under these mythologies of liberalism, of being the side that is fighting for the righteousness and human rights and the side of the good and all of that, which is a bunch of garbage, basically, because it does not withstand a critical scrutiny. When you put it up against actions that they take, you'll see that the mythology is just that, a mythology that is designed to conceal settler colonial violence. So that's one thing that Israel and Canada have in common. They actually, you know, it's almost sometimes silly for me to say. I feel silly for saying it, but we have to keep in mind that these states talk to each other and they exchange these tactics and strategies. You know, there's documented from the earlier parts of the creation of Israel, of Israel and the Zionist movement sending people to places like Canada, South Africa, the US, Australia, learning from them how they expelled, how they eliminated, how they forcibly assimilated Indigenous peoples through legal systems, through politics, through the military, through the security apparatus, and then they go and do the same thing. And now it's happening the other way. I mean, Israel is selling Canada security technology, quote unquote security. Obviously, it's for the purpose of domination, not security, and not that liberal concept of security. But anyway, right? Like there is a constant interaction, strategic and tactical exchange on the level of these states with each other, because they are all engaged in the same project of eliminating Indigenous peoples from their lands and repopulating them with people from elsewhere, which is exactly the defining feature of settler colonialism and what makes Israel a settler colonial state, what makes Canada a settler colonial state, Australia, and so on. So yes, I just wanted to kind of emphasize that element of what it is that of how it is that we have this kind of intuitive shared experience of domination and racialization, that really the critical element of that racialization for me is dehumanization, of being called lesser than, and we can spot We can spot the violences that we each experience, and we can spot the way in which those violences are concealed in mainstream public discourse. It's especially sometimes in that second part that we can really see the connections. We know how we become sort of brushed aside in our stories and our narratives. And I have more things that I want to actually say on that, but I'll leave that for the discussion. So I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, with that being said, I want to first give it to the audience to make sure that we don't run out of time. But if anybody does have any questions, this is just a reminder that folks can drop it in the chat. If you have something pressing or something you'd like to say, please, this is your time to just drop it. So then we can embed it in some of the discussion that we're having.
Jasmine, if I can chime in, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Yeah, just a quick, I guess maybe we can start with Veldon and then move on to Mark with this question. It's maybe if we start with, I guess, the direct victims of settler colonialism, and then maybe we can broaden the discussion. I really want to know, especially when we draw parallels and similarities between you know, the experience on Turtle Island and the experience in Palestine. You know, for example, you know, someone such as myself, for all my life and to this day, and I think the vast majority of people, you know, who, you know, walk around this earth and call themselves Canadians, we have no issue with the Canadian state, the Canadian government, the Canadian flag, and every institution or every symbol that represents the Canadian state. What I want to learn is those who continue to feel pain from, you know, from the settler, you know, the settler colonial policies that partially still exist till today. What is their comfort level with the Canadian state and its symbols? And I'm just trying to draw, you know, similarities and parallels between that and how many Palestinians who live under Israeli rule view also the Israeli state and Israeli government, which is not necessarily a completely settled debate, and many people grapple with this. You know, you have there are some you know, Israeli Arabs who are willing to take part in Israeli politics, for example, and many others who refuse obviously on very clear and obvious grounds. And so maybe Veldon, if you can give us some insight as to, you know, someone whose ancestors, or even someone actually till today, because this pain is still ongoing and the settler colonialism still survives till today. How is the Canadian state to be viewed and treated? You know, if we want to build a solid, moral, principled framework.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and maybe I can back up a little bit beforehand, because some of the remarks that well, Mark had made in some of his observations, and you know, it will start with sort of Canadian society and what that feeds into, or at least supports or lends itself to answering the question, what is the legitimacy of the Canadian state? In our eyes, you know, it's, you know, regarded as a legitimate state around the world, right? So under international norms, and I think this might get back to answer some of these questions. Why didn't we know about one another when, so Mark's playing on the playground when he was younger, and you know, there was only one sort of Middle Eastern individuals from, you know, from the Mediterranean area or around, but came from Lebanon in the middle of the 80s when I was, you know, in primary age school. And you know, so having like run from the Civil War and what was going on in Lebanon at that time, coming over to here, he's like, you know, and it was horrible because they had really like a racial slur for the kid that they were calling him on the playground. Me, I'm fairly white coated, but some of my other siblings are, I guess, almost stereotypically, phenotypically appearing as you know, the stereotypical Indigenous person with dark complexion, sort of Indigenous features, which, you know, figure prominently in the racialization calculus. But so why didn't we know each other? So let's start with society first, and then settler society. I think, and I had this discussion with my class yesterday of like, who is actually a settler. I think it goes back to exercising agency. So when we go and trace the trajectory of displaced people who are arriving over here, so refugees, I never count refugees as settlers. They're not involved in the conscious effort to eradicate our presence within indigenous territory, to repeople it with their own. Those that are running from violence don't really exercise real choice per se, right? So they're coming here and through an exercise of mutual aid, saying like, we are a port in the storm, usually offered by the Canadian state really on our behalf, and just saying, yeah, come on over here. It's we got all this land here. But growing up as a kid, I grew up just 10 minutes off my reserve and went to school in the playground with the likes of the Mark Ayyashes of the world. And we didn't really run into one another. Well, they knew we were like the indigenous families. There's a few of them in our grade school because we didn't have a school on the res, opposed to lower grades anyways, so we had to go to the high schools in town. And they had the same slurs for us. And so where do we meet up and start understanding one another and knowing, well, what's going on in the Middle East? But it is those sort of dominant dehumanizing discourses where one, Arabs and Middle Easterners are, less than, indigenous people are also less than. The news, if you're following current events, and even the sins that I paid for not taking international relations, though doing all this political science. I did the 1/2 credit in undergrad and did it on international economic relations, just to get that for my degree, and never took an international relations course again. And so never got to understand what was going on overseas and around the world, just from whatever you can digest from popular media outlets or what have you. So nothing really intellectually inclined, really mouthpieces for a neoliberal state and imperialist expansion elsewhere around the world. So American sort of broadcast dominant cable news that was piped into Canada through my teenage years or whatever was playing. So a little bit of a healthy dose of Jon Stewart through my undergrad years, which in a way did a great disservice. I mean, they made things really palatable. We can laugh at ourselves, look at us in our violent ways of being around the world. Haha, we're clowns, we're doing bad things. And even the white liberal audiences could digest that and be like, yeah, it's really bad what we're doing. So we didn't really bat an eyelash, and it became that sort of normalized discourse of, well, you know what, Jon Stewart will poke fun at it again tonight on the Daily Show. They just bombed a wedding in the Middle East or something, and there's a bunch of children and grandmothers showing up to see their grandchildren being married or something. And so the state in Canada where indigenous peoples were disenfranchised for so long, and really, what is the extent of us consenting to the legitimacy of the state beyond our participation in really electoral politics, where we go and check a box once every couple of years? We're not consulted, and when we do have the instruments that bind us together as nation to nation, the treaties, and Mark had this when he his opening remarks, is that they are largely ignored. And it was almost official policy between the 1920s and the 1970s that these treaties didn't mean anything too. So court decisions, the precursor to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Judicial Council, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, back in the 1800s in St. Catherine's Milling, just said, well, you know what? Indigenous rights exist at the will of the sovereign anyways. So it's just a matter of flexing our policy muscles. So it doesn't matter what we put down on paper anyways. And it still doesn't matter in terms of the human rights, because it was only 3 weeks ago, I guess, December 31st, when after 14 or 15 years of fighting for equitable support and eliminating what were otherwise really, unconscionable practices of removal of Indigenous children from our families and communities. So the large $40 billion sort of agreement in principle arrived at between Canada and the parties that brought the matters towards at the Human Rights Tribunal, the federal one. So Dr. Cindy Blackstock, her organization, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, is that there is that apathy within society. So when you arrive here and you're looking around, you'd be forgiven. One, I don't view you necessarily as settlers. Your displacement began a long time ago. It wasn't necessarily a conscious decision, though you don't necessarily need that to be a settler. You could just probably say, you know what, I'm picking a place on the map, and I have that luxury of picking that privilege around the world. I can uproot myself. But other people are doing it just because of a persecuted peoples around the world. And coming over here and facing that history that Mark says it is a national narrative that is, and I think he wants to say bullshit. Yeah, he sanitized his language. It was a deliberate manufacture, because the choice of citizens and education being how we shape a particular mode of citizenship, not just being like literate or numerate, is also what do you know about the country that you want to build or envision. So the settler imaginary is such that we didn't actually exist. So when you see us in the classrooms or on the playground as kids, what can you make sense of us? In the same way, growing up like 20 years ago, what sense that kids are making of Arabs or Middle Easterners is you're terrorists, right? So, I would never have wanted to live through the 2000s as somebody, with a dark complexion and having come from the Middle East, especially in large urban centers. But even like Amir, you said you're in Saskatchewan, in Regina. I did my master's degree there, the University of Regina, and that place was ungodly racist. It was unspeakably racist. When they use the N-word for proximity of their, hatred and contempt, and that dehumanization that Mark talks about, I'd be sitting on the bus and being that white passing sort of Indigenous person again. So I have a mother. I'm like, my dad's white, but my mom's Indigenous, and she, and she looks like the stereotypical, they'll, call her squaw and all those other things. Is like they were using words that would be normalized in Hollywood movies, like the sand N-word. They also be what did they call the Indigenous peoples, the forest N-words, or the prairie N-word out there. So I'd be sitting on the bus and I'm just, almost a white guy blending in, because Plains, Cree, and Soto don't present the same way that Algonquin do necessarily, although the way that the state treats us is almost the same, irrespective of our phenotypical appearance. That the state kind of is a reflection of society, but I mean the state is the Canadian state is beholden and in service to, I would say, organized capital to such a great extent that it would disregard a whole host. And why can't it perpetrate these human rights violations and fight the likes of Cindy Blackstock for 15 years, 28 court decisions, like that was applications, motions, and then going to decisions for judicial review and whatnot. And to say we want to fight to discriminate against the little brown kids on the reserves. And these are the same people that we have, or at least the same sort of, I guess, international player that the world would look up and say, what a great place, and where do you run to when you're running away from your place? You go to the place where purportedly they are the champions for human rights, and they'll protect you. You arrive here and then you see what they're doing to their own Indigenous peoples, and you get a sense that perhaps it's not much different, although you're not necessarily the target here. You're an instrument. So I don't know if that, I spent more time discussing society than the state. Yeah. So there's a lot of Indigenous people who have a hard time accepting the legitimacy of the Canadian state, since we had never consented to it, and even its origins, and for much of its beginnings, for most of a century up until the 1960s, we couldn't participate without foregoing quite a bit of our own enfranchisement in our own political systems, which were actually dismantled. So and then just sort of strangers coming up and claiming sovereignty, which is something that, I mean, you're all too familiar with now. So like I say, like, we're a little bit of a cautionary tale. So when you see it unfold over 200 or 300 years here, and we're left with a minuscule amount of territory, and it's either that or just, like, you know, forcibly integrate, lose your political institutions, but walk away from what you had been for centuries and millennia. Yeah, I can see Palestinians being backed into that corner as I look at those maps where more and more is being annexed into an external state. Yeah, so.
Yeah, if I may just pick up on
Yeah,
Veldon,
sure.
on his last point, and then come back to your question, Amir.
Sure.
Veldon is absolutely correct. That map, and I've said this before, and I keep saying it, that map has not finished shrinking. It has, that map keeps showing it, but it's not done yet. It's not static. I guarantee you, maybe someone in 1948 or 1967 thought, okay, well, this is bad, and this is where we're at. But no, it kept shrinking, and there's no reason. I don't see anything right now that makes me believe that it has stopped shrinking. Israel is continuously trying to expand its hold on Palestine. I mean, it already practices de facto sovereignty over the entire region. It already does that. It doesn't declare official legal sovereignty over certain parts of it, but that's a bunch of legal nonsense. That doesn't convince me. Let legal lawyers take that seriously. I don't. They do practice de facto sovereignty over the entire region. But that's not where they're satisfied. They want more. They want official legal sovereignty over the whole thing. They want an entire historic Palestine that has no more than about 10, 15, 20% Palestinian. That's it. That's all they can, that's all they're willing to tolerate, just as it is today within proper Israel proper, where it practices official sovereignty. That's the number they're comfortable with. How they're going to get there, I don't know. We've seen before how they've done it through war, where you have the mass expulsion of Palestinians. But even prior to 1948, there were small-scale expulsions, like the ones we're seeing just this week. One family at a time, one small piece of land at a time, and so on. So one of the main differences that people sometimes point to in terms of the differences between Israeli settler colonialism and, let's say, Canadian settler colonialism is the question of demographics. Well, there's more Palestinians there under settler colonialism than there are Indigenous people left here. But that doesn't mean that we're always going to be at this stage. And I don't know, the question of why, you know, why it hasn't reached that stage yet is complex. But Palestinian resistance is the reason. Obviously, there was Indigenous resistance here, which is the reason why settler colonialism never achieved total supremacy. The biggest difference, I think, was just germs and the way that germs were used to eliminate Indigenous populations on Turtle Island. Which is not something that was available in the context of Palestine. That's one of the crucial, I think, structural similarities between Canada and Israel, and conversely, of course, the similarities between the Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism and Indigenous struggles against settler colonialism on Turtle Island. in terms of questions about allegiance to the state, so or consenting to the state. So I know in public discourse these terms can be thrown around lightly. In academic discourse, they're heavy words, and there's a lot of debate around them. So there are no simple answers to your questions, Amir. What I can say, generally speaking, is that indigenous populations everywhere, including Palestine, have, like you said, have responded to the settler colonial state in varied ways. Some have said, let's just join it. That always remains a small minority, but it's there. You can find a couple of Palestinians, Palestinians who are citizens of Israel who say things like, I want to join the IDF, or some of them will go on Zionist speaking tours in the US and then they'll be like, see, Palestinians love us. And so there's always that minority of people that do that. As far as I'm concerned, they're the ones that Fanon and many other critical scholars have always been very harsh in their critique against, and I support that harsh critique against those people who have sold out, who have chosen individual gains over the collective struggle for freedom and liberation. Then there are, I'd say still the majority of indigenous populations everywhere who are fighting for liberation. That remains the majority, but within that majority, there are different strategies and different paths of resistance. So some do think that reform is possible within the settler colonial state structure. I'm not one of those. I'm not going to direct as harsh of a critique against them as I do against what I'll call the traitors. But that's not my path, but some have taken it. Some in good conscience or with genuine intentions for liberations, believe that you can reform it from within. I don't think the evidence shows that they are correct. I think the evidence clearly shows that they are not correct in that approach. And then there are various ways in which people will then take paths to strategically just try to oppose the settler colonial state, where they say reform is not enough and it needs transformation. That transformation can be small, can be radical. So you have very complex, study here of different political ideologies of how they envision change. Personally, I do think that radical transformation is needed. I do think that that all of this of what we're talking about is rooted in colonial modernity, in a 400 or 500, maybe longer, but at least 400 or 500 year history of a structure of colonial modernity that has emerged out of Europe, that cut up the world into these racial hierarchies that are based in imagination at the end of the day, but they have real powerful effects on people's lived experiences and realities, that have led to the enslavement and colonization of the world's majority. The overwhelming majority of the world's peoples have been negatively, destructively affected by this structure of colonial modernity. And I don't think that reform can fix this. And we do need, following a Fanonian kind of politics, we do need a radical rethinking of how we live our lives, of how we structure society and how we structure the state. Even move beyond those terms and ways of thinking. I know people think of the state as this like natural epitome of human progress and as the natural way of life. It's not. It's a relatively new invention in human history, probably a couple of 100 years old, could be 300, but not much more than that. People have organized in different ways before that. People will organize in different ways in the future. It's inevitable. Nothing lasts forever, including the modern nation state. I say the quicker we reimagine it, the better. And that includes Canada. And that doesn't mean the elimination of Canadians and none of that hyperbolic nonsense. We also hear this kind of hyperbolic nonsense from Israelis. Oh, they mean transformation. That means they want to eliminate Jews or eliminate Israelis. No, we're talking about eliminating structures that allow a group of people to dominate and have exclusive supreme sovereignty over another people. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about eliminating. So we're trying to reimagine how we can actually still live together, but live together in an actual liberatory, free, and decolonial world. And so, look, it's a tough task. It's a tough road ahead. But to me, those are, if that is the principle that guides you, then that ought to be more relevant than, do I wear the flag T-shirt or not? Or, you know, I do think sometimes people kind of get caught up. Okay, so someone says, I won't wear the Canada flag, and then they go on their lives as normal and do nothing to change anything. So what, am I supposed to celebrate that you're saying no to the flag, but you're not doing anything else? So I think sometimes people get caught up on these kinds of questions a little too much, and not enough on what's the principle that's guiding your actions and your behaviors in your day-to-day lives, and what you're demanding of politicians, what you're demanding of the state, what you're demanding of your fellow humans that live all around you, whether you want to call it citizens or non-citizens. To me, it shouldn't. The humans that live all around us are not all citizens, and so that's why I sometimes try not to use the word citizens, but people who you share this your social, political, economic, and cultural lives with. So to me, it always comes down to that principle, and that's more relevant than, do I have allegiance to the state? You know, what do I want? What does the flag mean to me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That squarely puts you into the language of the modern nation state. It doesn't allow you to ask more critical questions of it, and to reimagine how we live with each other. I hope that helps answer your question there.
Amir,
Oh, that certainly does. Thank you both, Mark and Veldon, for that.
We do have one question from the audience I will read. In a Canadian context, do we need to promote the similarity of the two problems? So in brackets, Indigenous and Palestinian, and how do we make this mainstream and publicly agreed upon? So how do we free our peoples is the question. It's a very small question. How do we free our peoples?
Yeah, I'm like Mark. I'm not actually a state reformist. I think there needs to be, and I'm not one actually either to revisit or try to say like, well, we need to revitalize past political organizations, those particular structures that might exist. You know, I have this sort of like Hegelian, sort of like what Zizek says, and maybe people might not like it too much, is that maybe this is an opportunity through colonialism. The Hegelian wound is through healing ourselves, is that perhaps we needed this injury of colonialism to imagine and to theorize new structures where we could find one another living in community as liberated individuals on the same plane, rather than the hierarchical scale, especially when it's really, and I go back to sort of the capitalism, is that it sounded neat in theory as well too, that social contract theory of like, let's all get together and create one sort of body and have a whole host of appendages. We'll create a bureaucratic apparatus, which, you know, and I think Marx was right, is that it just became that executive committee for the administration of capital's interests. So it was quickly seized by capital. It still seems that way. And so it's, I don't know, like, you know, Indigenous peoples have tried to work within it for hundreds of years. And especially, you know, when you find human rights regimes tied to it in the liberal Western state, or at least emerging from it, is that hasn't helped us either too, because we still find ourselves in the situation where there's ongoing human rights abuses that perpetrated by the state, or quasi-state actors too. So how long do you give it? And then to say to our Palestinian brethren, say, you know what, you should give it a shot with the dominant society and their control over the state, and say, why don't you jump in, sign treaties, organize your territorial matters, and federate the way that perhaps some indigenous peoples had hoped to become. It'll probably turn out different for you. I don't think that's happened really anywhere within the context of settler colonialism. And in other sort of colonialism, where it wasn't a matter of just like the whole settler imperative, where it's governed through military occupation, for example, from afar. The best that they have done was like set up an outpost or something in a governor's mansion to oversee the internal affairs of the colony. That still was a fairly brutal experience. Like, you could look at the administrative massacres of India, for example, of just putting the locals into place, and not having to endure sort of settler colonialism. Is just your plain old-fashioned sort of brutal colonialism, without the accoutrements of the nation following, from the motherland or what have you. So yeah, I think that modern statehood, even like we can all point to medieval statehood, and even that was just petty kingdoms, essentially using the territory for their own purse, right? So having a few dukes and viscounts in their pockets, to keep the peasantry working. We just transformed into something where an emergent bourgeoisie class can act as tyrants and not have to involve themselves in politics. Had little interest in that, but just making the money and having the state do it. So yeah, so getting back to what Mark says, what alternatives to a state structure can we organize and create, which would facilitate our liberatory aspirations? Yeah.
And I'll just kind of add to that, I guess. There are to me, when you're facing this kind of structure of power, which is overwhelming when you start to think about it. I mean, we're not just talking about Israel and Canada as if they're like single entities. We're talking about Euro-American Empire. It's all all the same power structure that we're up against. And when you think about that, most people, I understand, will just go, well, okay, I got, what can I do? What can I do? So it's difficult, but that, people who are oppressed by these structures, no matter how powerful they are, and no matter how little the oppressed people have, they'll always resist, because people just won't take it. Our peoples have shown that. Indigenous peoples have shown that. Palestinian people have shown that. People across the world have shown that. And to me, when you're facing that kind of power asymmetry, I of course have my own preferences, my own ideas about what strategies I like better, or what ideologies I'm more aligned with. But I'm also willing to stand back and say, all hands on deck, people. Try everything. At least for those who are genuinely trying in something that I disagree with, at the very least, they might be making teeny tiny gains, and at least they're just providing more proof as to what works and what doesn't work. So I'm not against, for example, people have used the legal system in really impressive ways, both Palestinians and Indigenous peoples. I mean, why do we have the TRC? We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because Indigenous activists forced the Canadian government through the legal system to create it. there was a settlement. It's not like Canada just woke up one day and was like, you know what, we did it wrong. We need to find out the truth. Canada knew the truth. They were hiding it in their archives. It wasn't about, if you hear Trudeau now, you'd think, okay, you know, Canada went out there and we sought our truth and we're striving towards reconciliation. No, you didn't. You were forced through a legal settlement to create the TRC, forced Harper to apologize. He didn't want to do that. He was forced to do it. So people have, you know, there's been groups out in, out west in BC, especially. I'm not an expert in these things, but you know, I've read that a little bit about this here and there in scholarly journals about how some legal cases out there did work, you know, in terms of territory claims and forcing a government to at least do some kind of a consultation of, you know, got in the way, threw a wrench into a company's plan, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe they're not achieving full decolonial liberation, but these legal strategies, if used wisely, if used strategically, can be effective. Palestinian cases, as well as Noor Arakat has pointed out, RDMC's works on these things here in Canada and internationally. They can do effective things. So it may not be my path, but I appreciate it. I can support it from a distance and so on. So to me, how do we get free? We keep trying. There's no simple answer to this. One thing that both of our ancestors have taught us is this is an intergenerational struggle, and we should, each generation should strive to achieve its liberation in its own time. We shouldn't, and I've been guilty of this. I've ignored that as well a little bit too much. I think Muhammad al-Kurd really has driven that point home to me over the last year, that no, we shouldn't, not to me personally, but in his talks, public talks, but we shouldn't keep thinking about this as we'll keep going forever. No, we want our freedom before I die. I want to keep my house before I die. I want my land back before I die. And each generation should think that way. But in case we don't, let's just be ready to pass it on to the next. And they'll keep going. And as long as the oppression continues, we keep resisting and we keep fighting. And we do that every day. So yeah.
Beautiful. We have one more question, and we are going to end at 8:30. So I'm just going to read the second question that we received. Despite the continuing pains in Canada, is there something to be learned from the Canadian experience which can be used in the Israel-Palestine context?
Yeah, I would say, and I think Mark brought it up too, is, you know, it's become sort of a buzzword. So, you know, transitional justice in some places, we sort of modeled, and I think around the world, we've modeled it after South America, post-apartheid. There's still a lot of tensions that exist there. Racism didn't end. Nobody really hugged it out. There were a lot of structures that were unsustainable within the really, I guess, kind of the postmodern era of statehood. If we're going to say we're postmodern, I mean, just advanced modernity anyways. But it's turned into, and in a lot of ways, yeah, sure, the immaterial gestures that the state makes can mean a lot to a lot of people. So the apologies that had come, it closed a few wounds for people just to hear I'm sorry. They might document some of the truth. They might want to air it. They still go to great lengths to conceal it as well. So we could look at the example of the St. Anne's Indian Residential School up in Fort Albany and that sort of Saskatchewan, the James Bay, Moose Cree territory, where they're still fighting because it had the notorious electric chair where, you know, it wasn't super high voltage, but it was enough for, you know, causing, you know, shock and a little bit of pain. It wasn't going to kill anyone, but it was there to such an extent that, you know, I would characterize it as torture. Like, you don't put little kids into things and shock them with enough electricity that well, it's not going to kill them, but it'll visit some pain into them just for kicks. But still concealing the truth and whatever sort of reconciliation. And just this afternoon, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller, had announced, well, we're going to put together this new reconciliation committee. So I'm going to appoint 5 people. And I think the first person who's named is former, part of the chair. He wasn't the chairperson, but there was 3 chair people of the TRC, and one of them was Wilton Littlechild. So I think that was the only name that I saw being named to it. And so far, having the calls to action, which a lot of them are symbolic and don't touch on the material lives of Indigenous peoples, has been a great failure, because this new sort of warmed up version of the former Harper Conservatives came in on the heels, riding on the social capital that Indigenous peoples sort of brought to them in the post Idle No More, revival of Indigenous politics that we hadn't seen since the Red Power movement, or even around Oka in the early 90s. I was still too young to be part of that current, but to understand it is shifting some of the public opinion in ways that, again, would warmed up to Indigenous peoples. And the Liberals that saw that, that's a place where we can kind of gain an electoral entry point, have done nothing, and they still fought. So I mentioned earlier the matter that's just been sort of decided as agreement in principle for the human rights violations of Indigenous children and families. The same sort of ministers and the Crown Executive Cabinet, especially Carolyn Bennett, who had previously been the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, didn't do anything, and in fact sought to fight against us. So you can't really have this reconciliation when it's when you're still taking these material maneuvers to deprive us of that standing and the means of living, actually. So it just became like a buzzword for them, and another electoral platform, so a slogan. And so, yeah, it can mean something. There's a lot of people who want to hear I'm sorry. So I again, not to sort of raise content that will invite pain for you, is that to say, you watch the news and you see sort of the summary executions of children playing by Israeli Defense Forces just being picked off. The arbitrary exercise of force in that way of executing women and children and whatnot. Maybe hearing sorry might close a few wounds, but yeah, I don't know. It's not something that has gone over as a great success for us. Yeah.
But resistance is still important.
Yeah, so I mean, you find in it, and as soon as you feel that sort of disappointment, once again, it can reinvigorate it, because you catch on, you're like, oh, I know what you're doing. You disarmed us for a while. So for a good 4 or 5 years, and they really were trying to trot out platforms where they were going to make, and they have made historic investments in expenditures too, which I mean benefit capital, because that's where it's going to. We're going to spend the public's purse and redirect funds into the pockets of these larger infrastructure projects, which are run by large corporations, multinationals and whatnot. So we might get some new water, some schools, and larger infrastructure projects that might bring us back up into the mid 20th century, but they're not willing to share sovereignty. They're not willing to go to, and I think I see another question somewhere about the 2-state solution, or what did I see somewhere? Is it in these questions and answers, or was it something that Amir had said earlier, and Mark? Would they be willing, or at least would they, sort of pull the wool over your eyes in these treaties where if you were to engage in something that would eventually be a two-state solution, and they say, you know what, we're going to share sovereignty, but then it becomes sort of a unilateral domination of the junior partner to the deal, right? So this is what we kind of see in a lot of the treaties, especially the modern treaties. So Mark, you'd mentioned, well, you know what, I really don't actually want to rain on anyone's parade if they think this is sort of a solution, because for the Inuit, and some of them talk about it with great pride, is the Nunavut modern treaty, which resulted in the creation of a new territory where they are a de facto majority, because they're about 85% of it, of the population up there. Is when they ratified it, I guess that was their vote to say and to consent to the legitimacy of the Canadian state when they were going to join in as a federated unit within the larger Canadian project. But where you could say, well, yeah, you guys can hold on to all the national functions and we'll keep the internal functions of what would be basically a province. We're going to be a territory, but we'll govern ourselves such a way. So yeah, there are people who exercise that self-determination and saying this is how we want to constitute ourselves and enter into political community with others in this particular manner. For others, obviously, the treaties have meant nothing to the crown elsewhere. So, yeah, in this matter of like transitional justice, is it really tongue-in-cheek kind of lip service? And yeah, again, I never really want to steal from survivors from Indian residential schools who said, you know what, I did not want to go through the painful process of the independent adjudication process where I'd have to bare my soul and all my pain and reopen wounds. I just wanted to hear sorry, and that was it. And that can mean so much. But what would it mean materially for the Palestinian nation in the future? And is it just really sort of like the crumbs from the table as well? Because it could be, it could cost them nothing oftentimes. So, and in subsequent documents, when we found out, is like the speeches that were written were like, this was a political decision. This was to, it was deliberate to disarm. So the speechwriter for Stephen Harper, who gave the apology in Parliament in 2008, in June 2008, was just like, yeah, we knew this was a political solution. So again, it is an exercise to disarm what was otherwise an antagonistic oppositional party. So.
Are we surprised by that though? Not
Yeah.
sure. I don't know. Mark?
They still have the land. They gave nothing back.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know. I just echo what Veldon is saying. So be wary of these techniques in which settler colonialism and the settler colonial state just tries to basically, yeah, put a stop to actual real resistance. I mean, in Palestine, we're nowhere near a truth and reconciliation. They haven't stopped the killing just this week alone. I don't even know how many have been arrested and killed, and homes destroyed, and people expelled from their homes just this week. And there's going to be more. Where the killing and the violences are nowhere near the end. So it's, you can't even talk something like truth and reconciliation in Palestine. And that's not counting all of the things that Veldon said, which I completely agree with, that these are ultimately mechanisms to ensure settler colonial sovereignty, because that's the one thing that they don't address. They don't address the fact that sovereignty was taken away from people who enjoyed sovereignty. They were sovereign people. That's who lived here, sovereign people. That's who lived in Palestine, sovereign people. And that's what they want. They want their sovereignty. And even when Palestinians were under the Ottomans, they still sought sovereignty, and they enjoyed more sovereignty certainly than they did, or than they do under Israeli settler colonial sovereignty. To me, the lessons that can be used are more from the resistance angle. than from the state's actions and policies, which again are not interested. They call, Rashid Khalidi called it in his book, the no of sovereignty. Israel has never been interested in negotiating anything to do with Palestinian sovereignty. The two-state solution, the agreement with the PA, the creation of the PA, it was all a mirage of sovereignty. People have called it fake sovereignty. It was just designed to create a structure that would help Israel govern the Palestinian population. And that's exactly what the PA does. Regardless of the intentions of individuals within those structures who might seek to do something else with it, that's what the PA does. And I just want, I know we only have 4 minutes left, but just very quickly, 2 excellent questions at the end around the idea of the state. It's a very quick, tricky one, because sometimes people, including myself, don't want to get into the language of the state, but sometimes you're in settings where it's hard not to. And people would say, okay, just give me 1 state, 2 state, and you go, okay, well, 1 state, but we can reimagine this. But there's no really enough time to explain what that imagination means, what that critique of the state is, et cetera, et cetera. So it's tricky to not use the word state at all in a world, saturated with the logic of the modern nation state. So, but we can sometimes strategically use it here and there, but still have as our guiding principle the desire to create a new world. Again, one that reimagines how it is that we're going to live with each other. And yes, it is not just a hypothetical possibility in terms of the last question. We know that people in the past, and I appreciate Veldon's point about trying to build something for the future, but we can learn things from the past as well. People in the past did live together. They did shared sovereignty. In fact, there's world historians that argue that the idea of a supreme sovereignty over specified land people is in itself a modern phenomenon tied to colonial modernity. That prior to that, even empires like the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Arab Islamic Empire, and other empires did not operate on that kind of sovereignty. And they actually operated on what people will call a shared and layered sovereignty. I'm not saying let's go back to those empires. So I agree with Veldon. We can reimagine a different way of doing it, but we're not destined to live under this notion of supreme sovereignty that belongs to one centralized force and no one else. We can have shared sovereignties. So yes, the answer, it's not a hypothetical. Yes, we can live as settlers and indigenous people together on the same territory, on the same lands. We can do that. The thing is, we already do. We just do it in a very violent way. We're trying to do it in a way that is not this violent, that would seek a non-violent sort of, as best as we can achieve that sort of existence, at least one that strives towards actual equity and justice and liberation and freedom. So that's the goal. So I don't think it's a hypothetical. I don't think it's a pie in the sky dream. There are different ways that people have lived in the past. There will be different ways in the future, but those ways in the future won't just come about on their own naturally. We have to build them. So you have to make choices as to what you're going to spend your limited time here on this earth to do. And I encourage you all to work towards a different world. I'll end it with that.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, that was a perfect note to end with. I want to thank you, and I also want to thank Veldon, both for your very valuable insights and for the very informative discussion that we were able to have because of your presence and because of everything that you shared with us. So we really can't thank you enough. I also would like to thank our moderator, Jasmine Hawamda. You did a fabulous job, and I really thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to have you moderate this discussion. And last but certainly not least, all of those who took the time to attend this panel discussion, a very big thank you goes out to you. We were honored with your presence, and we are very happy to see that there was a very good attendance for this event. Please be sure to check out the Olive Branch think tank's website at obtt.ca. We'd love to have you sign up to our periodic newsletters and updates, and hopefully there is more events of this nature to come. Once again, thank you to our esteemed speakers, Mark and Veldon. We learned a lot from you, and there's a lot to think about, and hopefully from that thought, we turn those thoughts into action. So thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, everyone.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you.